Before we get to today's episode, I should let you know that we've got merch. From hoodies and hats to tote bags, mugs, and more, you can now shop official National Post gear. It's a bold way to show your love for fearless journalism, and it looks good too. Visit postmedia.store to shop the collection today. Ottawa-Alberta relations took a step forward last week with the signing of an agreement that potentially paves the way for a new oil pipeline to the coast. The deal gives timeline on approvals for a pipeline should a proponent come forward and allows Alberta and the feds to calm the waters in an at times testy relationship. I'm Dave Breckenridge, this is 10-3. National Post politics reporter Stephanie Taylor joins me to discuss what went into the deal, what concessions Alberta had to make, and how this squares with the federal government's push for national projects, but also its environmental goals. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and even tell your friends about the show. So, Stephanie, last week, Alberta and Ottawa, Premier Danielle Smith, Prime Minister Mark Carney, signed an agreement that could possibly pave the way for a new oil pipeline from Alberta, presumably to the West Coast. And we'll get to those details about that agreement shortly, but this recent agreement came out of a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the two provinces back in the fall. And for listeners who may not recall what was in that that agreement, what did Alberta and Ottawa agree to last fall?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit in that initial agreement. And at a very high level, this memorandum of understanding that Premier Smith in Alberta and Prime Minister Mark Carney signed last November was really kind of hitting reset on the Alberta-Ottawa relationship. I'm sure listeners well know that things between Alberta and Ottawa were quite acrimonious under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the agenda he was pushing forward when it came to energy and the environment. So Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have really tried to I think carve out a new path. So that initial agreement, what was agreed to were quite a number of things. Essentially, the federal government signaled that it was open to suspending or not moving forward with a number of environmental policies, be it the planned emissions cap on oil and gas, be it things like the clean electricity regulations, signaling that it could be open to revisiting that oil tanker moratorium off the west coast of British Columbia. And in exchange for kind of opening and paving this path towards a possible West Coast pipeline, which is what Premier Smith is kind of what she's seeking as a main win from this, Alberta and Ottawa agreed to negotiate on getting Alberta to increase its industrial carbon tax, which Premier Smith had frozen at $95 per ton. And from this memorandum of understanding last fall, what has been negotiated over the past number of months has been largely this industrial carbon pricing part of the agreement. Now, both sides had initially set an April 1st deadline of figuring out when Alberta was going to be increasing its industrial carbon tax to $140 per ton from the amount it's frozen at now, which is $95 per ton. And what was really kind of at the heart of the negotiations was the timeline, how quickly Alberta was going to be willing to do that, what industry had to say about it. Now, there were the other parts of the agreement on methane regulations, for example, that the two sides were able to come together a little bit sooner on. But really, the main piece in Friday's agreement was kind of some finalization of the industrial carbon pricing piece, as well as some timelines and a bit more meat on the bones in terms of how both sides are agreeing to work together on opening and seeing a possible new pipeline built.
Yeah, and I mean, I do want to talk about some of the other kind of machinations that the Carney government has been going through with other provinces and other projects. But seeing as you raised it, looking at the deal last Friday, where did Alberta and Ottawa land on the carbon pricing, and were there any other concessions that Alberta made to Ottawa to get a deal signed, to get a potential timeline on a pipeline?
Yeah, well, going into that agreement, I mean, what the federal government is selling as its win is getting Alberta to increase its industrial carbon price. So the year that both sides decided on was 2040. I think there was a sense from Alberta that they would have been maybe willing to go past that a bit more. but where they landed was 2040. Now, under the current scheme, provinces and jurisdictions are supposed to be hitting $170 per ton by 2030, where Alberta and Ottawa landed was $130 per ton by 2040. So 10 years out from kind of what is currently on the books. And that's what the federal government is selling as a big win, saying, look, Alberta's a big source, the biggest source of carbon emissions from its oil and gas sector. So it's a win to kind of get them on board to do more there. And Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is also kind of selling this as a win, saying, listen, this is a heck of a lot better than reaching the higher goal that had been set under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now, what Alberta sees, unsurprisingly, as a big win is some more solid timelines around what the federal government might be willing to do in terms of granting approval for a West Coast pipeline. So there's a few key deadlines. One of the key deadlines is October 1st. That is when both sides agreed that it would work to designate this pipeline proposal to be in the national interest. Why that is significant is the federal government ushered in a law last year that would look to designate projects that it sees as being in the national interest as a way to fast track and expedite some of the approvals from a 5-year process down to a 2-year process. From October onwards, both sides also agreed that they want to have full approval on potential pipeline construction by September 1st, 2027. That's a pretty quick turnaround. And I think those dates are significant for Alberta for a couple of reasons. I mean, this October, depending on what happens with the court attempts and petition attempts to get a separation referendum on the ballot, that could be coming this October. And September 2027, fall, that's when there is a provincial election scheduled for Alberta. So I think Alberta getting kind of these timelines written down in stone, being able to take to industry at a time when it's looking to get a private sector proponent to come forward was quite significant for them.
As of yet, there's no proponent for a major oil pipeline. So these timelines, even though that they're there, as of right now, there's nothing for the government to sign off on. Is there a sense that this kind of agreement could see a proponent for a pipeline come forward? Did Prime Minister Carney or Premier Smith address that in the announcement of the deal?
Yeah, so both of them are saying, look, they believe that it's likely that one will come forward. Obviously, we can talk about the disruption that's happening in the Middle East, the demand from more Asian markets for Canadian oil and gas. But I note on Friday, as reported by Bloomberg News, the CEO of Enbridge made some comments that signaled they were warming to considering a West Coast pipeline. So certainly what Alberta's hope is that by putting these timelines down on paper, that signals a level of certainty that both sides are serious here. And as Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has said, industry and oil and gas companies have been burned before with past pipelines that have received levels of approval, but there's been challenges, there's been delays that has ultimately caused a number of projects to not go forward. So this is the argument Alberta is making as to why it is acting as this initial proponent. Now, critics like BC Premier David Eby will point out there is no private sector proponent on this one. Another important timeline to keep in mind is July 1st, because that is when Alberta is supposed to be submitting its proposal to the Major Projects Office. That is another federal body created under Prime Minister Mark Carney, which is supposed to be helping projects streamline their review process. And provincial officials in a technical briefing with reporters essentially said, stay tuned when asked, can you expect there to be a private sector proponent willing to put up its hand before that July 1st deadline and say, I'm actually willing to build this? Or I think there's still an outstanding question about whether the federal government might be willing to designate a project that is being proposed by the Alberta government, kind of funded by Alberta taxpayers at this point, to be in the national interest. And there is some hope that once you designate it, they will come. But certainly, I think all eyes are on whether there are any companies that put their hand up and say, yeah, we're willing to do this.
We'll be right back. Now, in advance of both the memorandum of understanding and then the agreement signed last week, there was a lot of talk about things that Alberta wanted to see happen. They wanted the federal government to repeal some unpopular legislation, the quote unquote no more pipelines bill, and the also quote unquote tanker ban. Were there things that Alberta or the feds wanted out of this that kind of were not a part of the discussion or ultimately did not get done? And where are those pieces left going forward?
Yeah, so work still left to do is going to be that Pathways project, that massive carbon capture and storage network that the Prime Minister Mark Carney has said without Pathways there is no pipeline. So the next round of negotiations are on what Alberta and Ottawa and industry, the oil sands companies that have kind of long pitched this idea of building out this massive carbon capture and storage network, where things are going to land there. I mean, this is a project that, again, the Prime Minister has linked carbon capture and storage network like the one being proposed. It is expected to cost billions and billions of dollars. It's one that the private sector behind it has signaled there's going to need some government help for at the very least. And there's going to be questions around the timelines there. So that is kind of still the outstanding piece of how is that piece going to work in this puzzle of opening the door to see a new pipeline built. But certainly, I think there's still a lot of questions about what gets done and where this all goes. Is the certainty that's being signaled behind this, is it enough to attract a private sector proponent? Now, to concerns over, say, Bill C-69 and the ongoing regulatory approvals, the Prime Minister, his government put out two discussion papers that have signaled a willingness to take a look at some of what's in Bill C-69, known as the Impact Assessment Act, and potentially make some changes. So it doesn't look like the federal government at this point is looking to an all-out repeal. I think if they did that, there would be concerns on the other side about what the heck does that do for certainty from industry. But the federal government is floating this idea right now about designating things as federal economic zones to give more upfront approvals to create a national kind of transportation corridors. Could that perhaps do something for a potential pipeline? In that original agreement struck between both sides in November, the federal government signaled a willingness to create some kind of a carve out for the oil tanker ban off the west coast of British Columbia. And when it comes to the question of a private sector proponent and what the federal government will or will not be willing to do with a pipeline, also comes down to the question of routes. Now, Premier Smith has said her officials are working on like 5 different routes. We're not sure where they're going to land yet. In an interview with CTV over the weekend, Premier Smith also signaled openness to perhaps looking at a southern route, not just through that northwest coast, which I think might be politically the most dicey one in terms of opposition from a number of coastal First Nations and BC's premier, but perhaps something to the south is a little bit easier to swallow including for BC's premier and BC Liberal caucus members.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about BC's premier, and he came out last week, and he wasn't exactly pleased with the agreement that was signed between Alberta and Ottawa. What are his major concerns, and is this something that could pose problems for the agreement going forward? Like, what kind of tightrope is the Prime Minister walking here to please everybody and to get some of these projects, again, that he's deemed in the national interest, get those moved forward?
So, I mean, the Prime Minister is expected to meet with Premier Eby sometime this week in Vancouver, and this is going to be top of mind. And Premier Eby, he's kind of expanded his criticism, not just to say we're not interested in another pipeline through the Northwest Coast and lifting of things like the oil tanker ban, but essentially saying he's concerned that this deal with Alberta might make British Columbia more uncompetitive and strike at some of the projects that maybe it wants to move forward. So I think when the Prime Minister meets with BC's Premier this week, he's going to have to find a way to sweeten the pot. And he's going to have to find a way to get Mr. Eby on board, whether that means getting on board with what he's thinking of doing with Alberta, but also making it known to Mr. Eby that he is very interested in a number of the projects BC has put forward. The major projects office, as I mentioned, that's going to be reviewing this pipeline proposal from Alberta, is already looking at about 20 other projects, many of which stem from BC, the liquefied natural gas. There's mining projects from other jurisdictions as well. So I think there's a question for the Prime Minister of not only what might you be saying to Mr. Eby to carve a potential path for a new pipeline through his province. But what exactly is he going to be telling the premier and offering the premier and discussing with the premier that makes BC's projects not seem like they are falling by the wayside? And I think he might have to do that with other provinces as well that are looking at this deal with Alberta and wondering, well, what about my projects? What about what I want for my jurisdiction?
Yeah, it's all about what's in it for me. It's when it feels like that sometimes when you're talking about the premiers and the federal government. One key piece of this is party politics, and kind of people dealing with their own battles back home in Alberta. While the government was calling it a win, there are people in the conservative movement, maybe not necessarily in the premier's own party, but people in her political sphere. People on the right saying that Alberta caved to Ottawa, especially on the carbon tax increase, and perhaps isn't getting as good a deal as it can out of Ottawa. And on the flip side, I know that there are some MPs in the Liberal caucus who were seen as big supporters of Justin Trudeau's environmental agenda, including legislation like Bill C-69 and Bill C-48. What has been the reaction from some Liberals in Ottawa, especially among the kind of the green wing of the Liberal Party? And is there concern that this deal between Alberta and Ottawa could cause a rift within the Liberals, especially as, the Prime Minister just got a very bare majority in the House of Commons? Could anyone leave the party because of this?
Well, I think all eyes are going to be on Quebec Liberal MP Stephen Guilbeault, obviously a former environment minister under Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Guilbeault he resigned from Mr. Carney's cabinet the day he struck this initial deal back in the fall with Alberta. And even before we kind of saw the full details of what this next phase looked like around the pipeline and industrial carbon pricing piece, Mr. Guilbeault had been warning about the impacts as he saw them, or the detriments of perhaps giving provinces like Alberta more time than less to kind of reach a higher industrial carbon price. So I think all eyes are on Mr. Guilbeault. He's been quite quiet about what he thinks from what he saw of this deal last week. But to your point about a very slim majority, I mean, we are expecting this summer to see folks like Jonathan Wilkinson, newly named ambassador to the EU, Nate Erskine-Smith, who has signaled publicly that he, and a Toronto MP, that he plans to resign his seat. And so that kind of increases the role the Liberal backbench is going to be playing about whether they may or may not just sit with the government, but support some of the government's priorities. At this point, some of the more progressive Liberal MPs, those who maybe did like kind of the Trudeau environment and energy agenda, and are a bit uncomfortable with seeing what Mr. Carney is trying to do, they've been quite quiet at this point. We'll see when that changes. The House is not sitting this week. It's going to be sitting next week. But certainly, I mean, heading into this unveiling of this deal with Alberta last week, a number of federal ministers, they had a call with BC's Liberal caucus. They had a larger caucus call as well. And I do think that this is going to be an ongoing challenge for the Prime Minister about how he tries to sell his caucus on, I think, what he describes as a bit more of a pragmatic climate plan, which is, being a bit more flexible with industries, not putting kind of, as he says, prohibitions or restrictions down, and kind of softening some of what the Trudeau environment and energy agenda has been. But at this point, folks are quiet, and I think we'll have to see what Mr. Guilbeault decides to do. And I think for someone like him, there's a consideration of where you might have the most influence. Might you have, right now, someone like Mr. Guilbeault, where if you're a caucus member that does have questions or concerns about that, staying in that caucus allows you to air your grievances behind closed doors and to make your point known. Then perhaps it might work, say, if someone made a decision to sit as an independent. I have no idea if that's what anyone is considering, or if it's at that point yet. But certainly, I think, the Prime Minister and his team would suggest that what the federal government got out of Alberta is better than the situation on the industrial carbon pricing side going into it. Now, from Alberta's perspective, I think there was a recognition that, as the Supreme Court decided a number of years ago, the federal government does have the jurisdiction to charge a carbon tax onto provinces and to put some federal backstop in place. So I think, might this be something Ms. Smith has to navigate with some of her constituents, particularly those who are making a lot of noise right now on the question of separation. Certainly, there's a lot of pressure on her to see whether she's able to deliver on this more collaborative relationship with Ottawa.
Stephanie, thanks for your time. 10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Stephanie Taylor. More from her at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.